Welcome to Left of the Law. In today's episode, we'll be looking at why millennials are increasingly defying political norms. And in this, I mean why millennials are becoming less conservative as time goes on. A recent column by John Byrne Murdoch from the Financial Times indicates that the direction that millennials are moving in has actually deferred the norms that were previously set by their predecessors. So in that I mean Gen X, the boomer and silent generation. So traditionally people have sort of stood along the idea that as you grow older you become more conservative. Now, historically, this has indeed been true. We've seen this with previous generations, the silent generation, the boomer generation, and Gen X. So silent generation, in that I mean those born between 1928 to 1945, the boomer generation between 1946 to 1964, and Generation X being born between 1965 to 1980. Now, the reason for these three sections of society becoming more conservative as they grow older is because it's sort of understood that as you grow older you have more responsibilities. For instance, you have mortgage payments to keep up with, you've got a family to look after, and people have really identified these tropes as being conservative, in quote marks. Having to conserve social norms and past norms. But what we've seen in recent times is millennials, so those who are born between the ages of 1981 to 1996, we've seen that group of the population actually become more left-leaning. So as the figure would show you is... So from the last election in both respective countries, from United Kingdom and the US, we've seen the percentage of vote share from millennials actually decrease beneath minus 10 points, percentage points, sorry. We've also seen the same with the US, with Republican vote share within the millennial circumstance falling, not as low as in the UK, but still almost, it's looking as if that is going to be the destination of the millennial outcome in the US. So it's actually, so you can see from the bottom, we've, millennials who were born between 1981 would be around 43-ish. So that is where the figure indicates. So they're more left-leaning than their counterparts. And I think there are three main reasons for this. And I want to tackle each reason in segments. First reason being housing. Second reason being income and wealth inequality. And the third reason being the cost of childcare. Since the 1980s, we've seen massive issues with housing within the UK. You can say the same about the US, but specifically the UK. This actually stems back from 1979, Margaret Thatcher's tenureship as Prime Minister of UK and as leader of the Conservative Party. During her tenureship, she aimed to essentially, as they would describe it, I mean the Conservatives, they would move away from Labour's economic failings, and they would, move forward with cuts, not as substantial cuts as we see, as we've seen with David Cameron and George Osborne's austerity programs, but cuts to public services, privatisation of key industries, Royal Mail being one industry, and also how this influences housing. Now, the idea that Thatcher really stood on was if you work hard, and this is really the meritocratic idea that conservatives tend to push. If you work hard, you should be rewarded with things like tax cuts. You should be rewarded willfully by the economy. The economy should provide you with a reward, because that's how essentially markets work. You work hard in school, you work hard at university, you get a good job, a solid job, and this should provide you with foundations in the future. In 1980, Parliament passed legislation that enabled people who were renting council homes. This gave them the opportunity to buy their own homes. So it was known as the right to buy scheme. But instead of just buying your home for perhaps market prices, I think average house prices during the 80s were around £19,000 to £21,000. It gave people who were currently under social housing the opportunity to buy their houses for a discounted price. This discounted price actually rose massively as time went on, and I think at the end of the 1990s, the discount hit around 44%. The policy in itself, in isolation, doesn't sound at all like a bad policy, right? You're providing assistance with getting on the housing ladder, and this in turn allows people to own property, allows people to build wealth, essentially. But the issue with this policy was that it was a policy that was looked into in isolation. It wasn't looked in accordance with a policy to go with it. So by that I mean, when you have housing policies such as this, they're great in isolation, as I've mentioned, but you need to have something that kind of works in tangent with it. People were obviously in love with that scheme. A lot of the Gen X generation, or you can get the Boomer to Gen X generation, were homeowners, and this is because of discounted house prices. It was so much easier to get onto the housing ladder and purchase your own home. But the issue was the supply of houses, and the issue today, and the issue with millennials, and the issue that will be apparent for Generation Z, Gen Z, is that the supply of houses is essentially little to none. It's very hard to get yourself on the property ladder because of the supply of houses, and a fall in supply of houses economically leads to an increase in prices. And this is why we've seen a drastic change in the cost of housing in the UK. As I mentioned, £21,000 national average. This isn't adjusted for inflation, by the way. And then if you look at 2022 prices for a house, you have £260,000. Now, that drastic change is very scary. It's very worrying and scary. It is only around about 40 to 45 years, but it's definitely very, very worrying, and it very much highlights the direction that our current governments have, or our past and previous governments have gone in. They haven't really been stringent enough in trying to control market prices, and rather they've been so fixated on getting every single person on the housing ladder, they've completely forgotten the impacts and how to actually look out for the future generations. And that in itself is the millennials, because the millennials are, as I said, around about 40 years of age. So these people are your traditional homeowners. These are the people that are at age where home ownership should be a pinnacle ideal or ambition, but they aren't able to do this because of the fact that houses have become more expensive. Now, I would argue for sure that this policy, the right to buy scheme by Thatcher, was very much deliberate. So she knew economically that this would create a shortage in houses, and as a result, this would create a long-term price increase in houses, assuming that the next government wouldn't deal with the housing supply issue. Of course, John Major's government didn't. So this essentially benefited more so those who owned loads of property, even those who are wealthy, who aren't even living in social housing. They are still able to benefit from the inflated house prices. Now, in the long term, this definitely saw effect. House prices did increase, but I'd argue definitely that this was a policy error by Thatcher, and this was definitely something that was deliberate. Another issue was that 1 in 3 were buying homes, by the way, during the time at which the policy was introduced. Another issue was that because houses are being sold at discounted prices because you are essentially buying the house you previously rented, the money that local authorities or councils would have accumulated from rent is no longer being there because people are buying homes on discounted prices. And this is leaving, or this left, councils or local authorities with lower budgets, lower amounts to allocate towards increasing the supply of houses, right? And that was essentially the massive issue with this policy, because as I said before, it was a policy that was considered in isolation. As you look at your manifesto sheet in 1979, you look at making it easy for you to get housing. And of course, as I said before, this is something that was very, very beneficial to the boomer and the Generation X generation. But this hasn't benefited the conservatives in any way, of course, because millennials aren't becoming more conservative as time goes on. I saw something on a Reddit forum that how can you become more conservative when there isn't anything to conserve? And I haven't really gotten into the current state of our economic affairs, but I will get into that in due course. Something I saw on Twitter recently was a breakdown of income in comparison to 1993 to 2022. A young person, right, for instance, they're earning £11,000 per annum, per year. The average house price in 1993 is 51,000. So even within the proximity of 3 years, house prices were going up massively. House prices doubled essentially from £21,000. They doubled around about 2.3%, give or take. So a young person is able to afford to buy a house, or they can try and buy a house, because house prices are 4 times their salary, right? Now, fast forward to 2022, if you adjust that £11,000 per annum to inflation, that is around about £25,000. And if you also adjust the £51,000 original price for houses in 1993 with inflation, you should have, in theory, £110,000. That should be the prices of houses in the current economy, in the current market. But what you don't have is that price, and what instead you do have is prices being massively higher than that figure, £250,000, around £260,000. So instead of this being 4 times your income, this is rather 14 times your income. So essentially, a £25,000 annual income isn't able to suffice to get yourself on the housing ladder because of how much housing prices have increased over the last decade or so. So that in itself is a little case study, but I think this massively indicates the direction that this crisis is going in. So income inequality actually massively increased during Thatcher's tenureship. So when she came in, income inequality was around 2.4%. When she left government, it rose to 34.9%. A very big increase, actually. There's a reason for her policies. The poll tax was something that was very, very damaging to young people at the time. However, this didn't really influence the direction that Generation X, who were the last generation before the millennials, it didn't really affect the direction that millennials went in. Generation X went in. In terms of current income inequality, we've seen massive, so not only income but wealth inequality also. I'd say more so wealth inequality. So we've seen massive wealth accumulation since 2008 from those at the top, those 2 to 1% earners, or those who own a majority of the UK's wealth. So these economic crises being caused by banks and financial institutions is actually making people wealthy, because essentially the idea that banks are too big to fail means that we're too big to fail. So why should we, change the way we operate? Why should we reduce our risk tolerance? Although governments have tried to impose policy that kind of tightens these regulatory acts, it hasn't really been as effective as intended. So what we've seen is actually in recent times, the booming house prices has actually created more millionaires than ever before in the UK. So wealth inequality is a massive issue. The middle classes are being squeezed, and because the middle classes are being squeezed, it means this actually does tie into home ownership. It means that wealth isn't being able to pass down or trickle down to the millennial generation. So the millennials at this stage, these are the principal voters. These are the current, not current, but those were the current recipients of 2008 policies, 2008, 2009 economic financial crash policies. They were also recipients of the conservative government's austerity measures. They were the massive recipients of cuts to public spending, increase in taxes in proportion to GDO ratio, and there isn't anything for them to be satisfied with, essentially. Even not even accounting for Brexit as well. That is also something that has really damaged the trajectory of the millennials' economic prospects. Social mobility has stagnated. People aren't able to climb social ladders because of how difficult it has become to accumulate wealth, as those who were previously born into wealth have. That is a massive issue, and that's in part the reason why I believe the millennials have actually become less conservative, and they have become more left-leaning in both the UK and the US. But the third point of discussion is what this mean for future generations. So of course we've seen millennials become more left-wing as they grow older. What does this mean for not only the future generations, so Gen Z or Gen Alpha, but what does this also mean for the Labour and the Tory parties? So beginning with generations, so I think we will see Gen Z become more left-leaning for sure, because I'm 18 and I'm growing up in a country where the economic circumstances are absolutely terrible. The economic system is destroyed. There needs to be a massive change. So for people of my age, I'm part of Gen Z, of course, we aren't really looking towards a conservative government to fix our problems. I'm not really even looking to a Labour government to fix our problems. However, they are the next best alternative. So naturally, we are going to become more left-leaning because, we want more wealth distribution. We want more income increases. Now, what this does for the Labour and the Tory party, so beginning with the Tory party, they really need to get back onto the drawing board and actually look at their policies, look at the direction that they're going in. Trying to be reincarnation of Thatcherite ideas that were even in its effect very, very ineffective isn't really the way to go, I'd say. I think they really need to become a more compassionate party. They don't actually subscribe to the idea, despite them always saying they're a compassionate party. They should really scrap the idea of free marketism or meritocratic societies, because we've seen in recent years that these concepts aren't effective. When you cut public spending, and when you as Thatcher did, when you allow private sectors to essentially operate on their own accord, we've seen with Royal Mail are wholly inefficient with the way in which they deliver parcels and provide services for the United Kingdom. We've seen railway industries be very, very inefficient, and they're actually increasing prices of services on railways. So we haven't really seen effective free market ideas that have been intended or put into place by Thatcher or by her counterparts. We've actually seen regressive moves or regressive consequences as a result of these ideals. So the Conservative Party really need to understand, firstly, how can we improve the housing situation? They're not going to be in government, of course, in the next 2 years. That's definitely not the case for them. But I think in the future, they need to, understand how can we perhaps, become more of a united party in that we have a centrist ideal. How can we solve the housing crisis? How can we actually understand the issue with the housing crisis, and how can we put into place a solution for this? Keir Starmer of the Labour Party is, currently siding by the idea of, helping people get onto the housing ladder. Yeah, that's a good policy in isolation. However, you need to understand that, in order to keep, the books of Labour, keeping in the good side of Labour voters, you need to have policies that are intended for the future as well, because it's all well and good you're assisting people now to get houses, but what is that policy doing for the future? Is that policy hindering the opportunities for future generations? We've seen Thatcher. She was very much in favor of course, allowing people to buy their homes from councils, but this didn't really have much of a beneficial effect to millennials, and millennials as a result aren't really subscribing to the traditional conserve ideology. Obviously there's more factors, but housing is one of them. Of course, it has to be touched upon. The Labour Party must understand, as I mentioned, they need to look into longevity, but they also need to become an economically sensible party, a party that is very stringent in tackling things such as wealth and income inequality. I don't expect the Conservative Party to do this at all, but tackling problems that are very much growing as time goes on. It isn't just a statistic that exists. It does actually affect people within the economy. It does affect it does affect a big proportion of the economy. So if wealth inequality is growing, if income inequality is massively growing as well, then that doesn't really help anyone but those at the top. So the Labour Party needs to adopt stringent economic plans. For that, Rachel Reeves needs to try and tackle income inequality, income and wealth inequality. They need to have a very much reformed tax system, a very stringent tax system, a tax system that doesn't enable you to evade tax easily. You need to have a way to reduce loopholes. I think they need to also try and bear down on criminal activity such as fraud. If you're able to crack down on illegal activity and things that aren't really falling in line with economic principles, then you are able to find additional money in the budget, and you don't have to resort to austerity measures, because we've also seen austerity being a massive down factor in the current state of our economy. The IMF actually advised George Osborne not to pursue austerity measures. There wasn't a need for austerity. The idea that bringing down the deficit, why it shouldn't have been such a priority for the government, but it was, and they decided to opt for austerity, and that has actually crippled our public services. That's why part of the reason why we've seen the NHS on its knees in recent years. We've seen nurses striking for better pay. Things like that are perpetuated by the fact that the previous governments have been ineffective in their economic policy. They've tried to, do the sensible thing, as they say, but this sensible thing has actually caused or led to unintended consequences that haven't really been accounted for as of yet. So I think the Labour Party needs to very much take and seize this opportunity, because opinion polls suggest that they are the favourable party. I'll leave an opinion poll on the screen right now. They are the favourable party out of them, the Conservatives. So they have an opportunity essentially to grapple with the millennials and also look into providing a platform for Generation Z, my generation, to thrive economically and socially in this current state of the world. Now, in the coming days, I will be releasing an essay that is very much about income and wealth inequality in the United Kingdom and the US. So in that, I'll be looking at things such as house prices, and how this has actually intrinsically led to certain parts of the population accumulating and amassing massive amounts of wealth, and how the onus on assets being very much one of the ways in which those who are 1% earners in the UK are able to accumulate and maintain wealth, and how these things are actually damaging the potential the UK economy has to offer, and they're damaging and actually putting people into precarious situations in terms of their wealth and income. Wealthy people are able to save, those on low incomes, those who don't have much wealth aren't able to save, things like that. Why is the wealth gap widening? Why is inequality rising? The essay will be detailed, and it will be very concise as well. So please be on the lookout for that. If you did enjoy this video, please be sure to leave a like, and any comments and any suggestions you have to offer the channel, please be sure to leave them in the comment section down below. I really enjoy reading your messages and reading your comments. I think it's very good to spark a debate in the comment section. I think it's very interesting to see some of you guys talk with each other and communicate and converse as well. So please definitely leave comments in the comment section, and feel free to spark a debate if you feel necessary. And if there is anything in this video that I've touched on that you perhaps feel as though I should have elaborated on more, I could have maybe broken down into a simpler process or a simpler explanation, then please also leave that in the comment section down below. If there's anything you don't agree with wholly, definitely leave that in the comment section down below as well. Please be sure to share and like the video as well, and turn on post notifications so you don't miss any future videos that Left of the Law has to offer. And see you guys in the next video.